Good morning. We got morning for another hour here. My name is Alex Slacky. I work in Public and Government Affairs for AAA Northeast. And I'm excited to welcome you all today to the first in our Road to Reauthorization webinar series, looking at all aspects of the federal transportation reauthorization and how it could affect our work in our communities. I'm delighted to have my first guest here, Joung Lee, who is the Director of Policy and Government Relations for AASHTO, which is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. And before he was at AASHTO, I know that he did work at Federal Highway Administration, and he just told me up in Glastonbury in Connecticut. So he's very familiar with the Northeast region, and we're really happy to have him here today. And I'll just let you start it off. You can, tell us what we need to know about transportation reauthorization, and then we can get into some Q&A. And for the folks in the audience, feel free to submit any questions that you might have in the chat, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. But Joung, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. So yeah, my name is Joung Lee, Director of Policy and Government Relations here at AASHTO. And so at AASHTO, we represent all the state DOTs around the country. So obviously Connecticut DOT, along with all the other Northeastern state DOTs, are our members. We've been around for, I guess, over 100 years plus at this point. I think that's similar to AAA. And started out as a highway-oriented organization, but really evolved to cover all modes of transportation. And so kind of taking a systemic look at integrating how we travel using all modes of transportation is a key part of our platform now. And I'm really just delighted to be able to speak with you this morning, and want to keep my remarks fairly brief because I think you all have heard a lot of this national level conversation about infrastructure, and would certainly love to share our perspectives from the state DOTs based here in DC, but want to hear your thoughts, your questions as much as possible as well. Maybe I'll just start by saying, speaking of kind of that national discourse, we have a fairly small industry, I think, for transportation, at least here in DC. We got all the alphabet soup associations represented in all sorts of industries. And transportation is something that typically has not been a 1A or even 1C issue, right? It's always about like national defense, foreign policy, jobs, broadly speaking, healthcare, etc. And so I feel like, maybe 5-10 years ago at the State of the Union address, mention just of infrastructure or transportation is made, we're like really excited. Hey, like we're part of the game. But obviously the expectation has been raised substantially, really. I mean, I think, in the lead up to the 2016 presidential elections, there were competing platforms all focused on infrastructure. A lot of talk, as you all know, during the Trump administration about infrastructure investment, and it's come right back again. But we really do feel that it is kind of the 1A topic now. And so, for all the action that's taking place, it would be for naught if, it fails as it can, and we are kind of stuck with the existing program extension as something else then comes into the forefront and then kind of takes over, that very limited window that I think that we have to actually get something meaningful and substantial on infrastructure done. But we are excited about what's taking place right now. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the state of play. So you've seen at the very end of March, the American Jobs Plan come out to kind of really frame the discussion from the Biden administration about what they envision in their infrastructure agenda. And it is, as they make it clear, I think every time I hear from them, that it's a one-time boost above the current funding levels. And the overall numbers obviously have changed from over 2 trillion initially to now about 1.7 trillion. And it looks at all forms of, I guess, what's been talked about as traditional infrastructure and various other aspects of the federal program as well. When we kind of dive into what our members work on in terms of the highway, transit, passenger rail, aviation, and the specific modes of transportation. What we see is that there is this focus on kind of what they call fix it right on roads and bridges, that is emphasizing kind of the existing asset maintenance rather than looking at new capacity. It's also looking specifically at bridges, big and small. There was this talk about like 10 big bridges, and what are those 10 big bridges? They haven't identified those. 10,000 smaller bridges, how would that get done? And I think some of those have raised the question about, oh, well, how are the funds distributed? Is it by formula, as it traditionally is with the highway program, or is it by discretionary grant programs, which our members are not big fans of those, like the build or infra grants that take a lot of time and money to prepare the applications for, but then you have like a 5% chance of landing it. So it's very hard to plan your capital program around discretionary grants. But we also recognize that, I think you see it from every administration, that is the most direct lever that they feel they have in kind of the time window that they have to maximize, as much change as they want to see happen. And what we from the AASHTO side continues to communicate to both the administration and Congress are our core policy principles that our board of directors, all the heads of the state around the country, adopted a couple of years ago. One is ensuring timely reauthorization of a long-term federal surface transportation bill. As you know, the FAST Act extension expires at the end of September this year, so we want to avoid another series of short-term extensions that create massive disruption for our members and see that next 5-year bill done on time. The second one is enacting a long-term sustainable revenue solution for the Highway Trust Fund. It's running about a $13 billion cash shortfall every year that has been helped with over I'm trying to think now, $150 billion worth of general fund transfers over the last 13 years, which is no way to run a trust fund-based program. Number 3 is increasing and prioritizing formula-based federal funding provided to states. 4 is increasing flexibility, reducing program burdens and improving project delivery. And then 5 is supporting and ensuring state DOT's ability to harness innovation and technology. We are seeing, I think, a lot of those aspects of our policy proposals being reflected in some parts of what's taking place on Capitol Hill. But maybe what I'll do is take a step back real quick and really acknowledge that right now is really the make or break week in terms of the ongoing negotiation between the president and the Senate Republicans at the macro level on this infrastructure package deliberations. I mean, I think between the counter proposals from the Senate GOP and kind of the revised administration proposal, it still remains pretty uncertain in terms of how the contours of both funding and policy aspects of this final deal might look like. And obviously, how it all interfaces at the end of the day with the 5-year FAST Act reauthorization is uncertain as well. We've made it clear to Congress that that reauthorization still remains the bread and butter of the state DOT programs. That long-term certainty is just so important. Increased funding levels obviously would be nice, but any kind of one-time large funding infusion, we saw this with the Recovery Act 12 years ago, and then what the administration is talking about, obviously we'll take it, but we have to figure that out alongside and with the 5-year reauthorization. And when the numbers being talked about from the administration, as I mentioned, is above the baseline, and then what the Senate numbers coming out, they've talked about almost $1 trillion over 8 years, is inclusive of the existing /baseline spending. That's not apples to apples, right? That's a pretty huge gap still remaining on how things can come together just on the numbers front. But we are encouraged, at least on reauthorization deliberations, what's taking place in Congress, especially what the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee did last week. They had the 20-0 vote to approve the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act of 2021, provides $304 billion in highway funding, which is their sole jurisdiction between 2022 and 2026. And I really do think that's a really significant action, because it shows that the Democrats and Republicans can come together to support a bipartisan package, which AASHTO has called for all along. We are also expecting to see the House T&I Committee, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, having their committee markup next week on June 9th. That is a full package, not just highways, but also transit and passenger rail as well. We do also expect that to be a partisan package, not the unanimous bipartisan like EPW. So it's going to be more of a drawn out conversation, or a markup with a lot of amendments being offered, and we'll see what happens there. But it is reflective of what happened at that committee and the full House floor about a year ago. That was also a partisan process to get HR2 done. So I think, at this point, there are really three perhaps plausible scenarios going forward. The first would be this long, elusive bipartisan approach that reaches consensus on surface reauthorization as that core piece of the overall infrastructure puzzle. And that will require pretty substantial movement, right, from both parties in terms of the scope and definition of infrastructure, along with the all-important revenues needed / pay-fors, whether it's for part of the package or all of the package, from a combination of taxes and user fees. And as you've heard, pretty far apart still, because the Democrats are looking at adjusting the corporate tax rate, which is a no-go for Republicans. The Republicans are talking about dipping into kind of what they call the unused COVID dollars from the American Rescue Plan earlier this year, and then the various COVID relief packages last year as well, alongside implementation of user fees on electric vehicles and transition to the vehicle miles traveled fee, both of which are a no-go from the administration's perspective. The second path could be that there is a bipartisan deal just on kind of the infrastructure as can be defined agreeably, but then moving to a partisan / reconciliation-based package for everything else, including whatever else doesn't get covered in a bipartisan basis, and then essentially all of the American Families Plan, which followed kind of the release of the American Jobs Plan that had the infrastructure package in it. The third perhaps would be a fully partisan approach to everything, where the Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan get across the finish line by perhaps the end of this federal fiscal year, maybe even after that, but certainly this calendar year through the budget reconciliation process. And as you probably heard, pretty arcane rules associated with reconciliation, but one of the key factors is that policy changes are much harder to make than through the traditional surface reauthorization. And I think, under this reconciliation scenario, there's a very good likelihood of taking away pretty much any momentum on, surface reauthorizations / any additional infrastructure to figure out that 5-year surface reauthorization done by October 1, which would then negate, I think, the great work again done by the EPW committee, for example. All of this is also complicated by obviously the return of earmarks. The House has obviously taken the first steps in outlining their process, especially with the T&I committee that pushed back the reauthorization markup date a little bit. We are appreciative of the fact that the T&I committee, for example, instituted at least more, I think, clear safeguards for how earmarks are done rather than the freewheeling days of the late 2000s. By having, any projects submitted by the members have to conform with the existing TIP and STIP, the existing capital programs that the states and localities have already identified as priorities, making sure that the full funding for the submitted projects are already identified, rather than, say, identifying 5 or 10% of funding, leaving the remaining, uncertain, and really causes, challenges for states have to then reallocate, existing very tight funding to complete whatever those projects were and that's been the case in the past, and we hope that that's not going to be the case going forward. But on the Senate side, there is more warmth, I guess, or coming around to doing earmarks as well there, but uncertainty there, and big question on how the overall funding allocations would be then split for some in terms of providing earmarks, and then hopefully as much of the rest as possible from our perspective for the formula-based apportionments to states. So, I still want to end on a optimistic note here, because I look back at the MAP 21 reauthorization bill, that materialized in June of 2012 against all conventional wisdom. At the time, there was no deadline of any sort. It just kind of came together. And then the current FAST Act, that also happened, in December of 2015 against all the odds at the time. So it is absolutely possible to get a strong reauthorization bill done. And whether it is done as part of a standalone or as part of an overall infrastructure package that provides additional plus ups and funding for many other federal priorities still remains to be seen. But I think the goal again is to make sure that all this work, all this conversation, all this energy that's spent on it actually turns into meaningful action that benefits us all. So really look forward to your questions and comments.
Appreciate that, and again, anyone feel free to submit questions, and there are a couple that come to mind initially. You mentioned the work of the EPW committee coming out with this bipartisan bill, 20-0, 34% increase compared to the last reauthorization package. That seems like the main bipartisan agreement is that we should increase highway funding some amount. There's not necessarily the agreement on funding, like you said. There's not necessarily agreement on transit or how to deal with electric vehicles, or even certainly for highways, the level of the increase that it should be. Are there other areas of bipartisanship that you're seeing? Obviously, there's a lot in that EPW bill. Are there any other important areas where there does seem to be bipartisan agreement, whether it's on funding or on policy that that would be important to highlight and try to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the highway side is definitely the one that comes to mind, I think, easily, right? In terms of when you talk about infrastructure package, most people think of roads and bridges. So they got that done. And then, the other one is broadband deployment. There is actually already agreement between the administration and, the Senate Republicans on the amount of funding for broadband in the package. And then on airport aviation investments as well, there is pretty good, I think, understanding or agreement that the substantial boost there is desired. It really starts to kind of, get further apart when it comes to, I would say, transit funding. So what the House Republicans put out through their version of the reauthorization package that came out a couple of weeks ago looks to essentially flatline transit funding for the next 5 years, no annual increases there. And then the Senate Republicans' initial counteroffer in April would actually reduce transit funding compared to the regular inflation adjustment that you look for every program as the baseline going forward. The newer Senate Republican counter offer just essentially flatlines transit. So that's a huge gap where the administration wants to do a lot more, I think, relative increase on transit compared to highways, and then the flatlining counteroffer from Republicans, hard to bridge that one. The other one I would say is the passenger rail is an even bigger gap. The administration wants to make really substantial increases on passenger rail investments, but I think from the Republican side, they don't like the existing level of investment, primarily done through Amtrak, and so it's hard to see what that compromise level could be on something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly here in the Northeast, we know transit is so important. Really, to the 5 states that we cover, from New Jersey up to Massachusetts, transit is so crucial to to the economy and to our region's mobility. But I did want to ask a question about funding. We've heard talk of corporate tax rate for sure. That's something that the president has proposed. And I know, the CBO and I think the Congressional Research Service as well, they've come out with reports that are talking about, increasing the gas tax. That seems to be something that the administration, I think, said just a few days ago in response to the increase in gas prices. They said, we're not pursuing a gas tax. Like, that's a non-starter for us. They're talking about a VMT fee, which even in the rosiest scenario of the policy wonks would be a pilot to start, and I think would take quite a bit of time to encompass everyone or replace the gas tax or anything like that. Then they talk about tolls, which there are obviously lots of political issues locally. I mean, I think tolls are an increasing source of revenue, but I don't know if they'll be able to make up the big gap in the trust fund. Is it basically foretold that we're moving away from a user fee based system? I mean, we haven't seen the gas tax increase since 1993, and the prospects for its increase are probably, the lowest that they've been, or they don't get any higher. So are we moving away from that paradigm?
That's been kind of this existential question, really, now, since the first trust fund shortfall back in 2008. And, I think certainly from AASHTO's perspective, we've offered this menu of options over the years, 38 different possible revenue mechanisms to Congress. And they've asked us, eventually, like, okay, out of all these, what really makes the most sense? And so our board of directors adopted a measure that kind of put their necks on the line too, right? Because they're appointed by their governors. But it should surprise probably nobody that what they coalesced around is one, motor fuel tax increase and indexing. Second is a per barrel oil fee, which is a more upstream version of the traditional motor fuel taxes. And three, freight-based user fee, and then fourth being the vehicle miles traveled or mileage-based user fee. I think, you make a great point, Alec, about the gas tax is something that I feel like maybe, a couple of years ago, more and more folks were warming up to it, and it may be something, hey, okay, maybe if this trend continues, we can see something there. But then folks have taken a step back, and then it's pivoted kind of to a point where a lot of the Republican, the ranking member of the T&I committee, Sam Graves from Missouri, he's actually talked about the VMT fee now for 3-4 years at this point. Senator John Cornyn from Texas has talked about VMT quite a bit the last few months. Even, Senator Barrasso of Wyoming, who used to chair the EPW committee, talked about truck-only VMT before. So there is definitely interest in the VMT. But as you said, Alec, I mean, you're absolutely right. We're still not ready for it at the national level. We have states like, Oregon and Utah that do have not a pilot program, but an actual permanently run VMT program, especially in Utah's case, looking at EVs, right? Rather than through a one-time EV registration fee, a lot of states have. This is an actual user fee, right? Collected on a regular basis in lieu of motor fuel taxes. We've called for, really leaning in on the state experiences in the next bill to help frame and develop the national VMT, but that's still not going to be ready for the next reauthorization bill. And I feel like, we've talked about it now for over 10 years in transitioning to VMT. And it really is time where whatever the next bill does, most likely based on general fund transfers to, additional general fund transfers to carry it out, but then being able to pivot to VMT will be crucial, because it looks like, the gas tax increase is not any closer than it ever was, which isn't close at all. So.
And we have kind of an audience question that jumps off of that, is just what kind of time frame do you think we would need to implement VMT nationally across 50 states, and more than just a pilot program, but really implementing it more fully, especially as we're seeing states start to say they're going to ban internal combustion engine vehicles in another guess 12, 13 years?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that's where at least the federal program under the FAST Act established the Surface Transportation Funding Alternative program. It's the seed money provided to states that want to try different ways of collecting revenues beyond the traditional motor fuel taxes. And, again, like even now, the motor fuel taxes comprise about 90% of the federal highway trust fund revenue. So that's a big hole to cover at the national level. And similarly at the state level, most or every state has the fuel tax, in addition to various other fees as well. But again, I think if there is this concerted political support across the board, and there is, I think that's the one optimistic thing is, again, because of the Republicans' push for VMT, there is more of a bipartisan interest, I think, in acknowledging that the trust fund is broken and here's a specific mechanism that can fix it that we haven't quite had before. So to the extent that the next federal bill can move, it along from the state-based kind of pilots to the national pilot and full implementation program. I mean, I don't know if the 5 years is enough to be able to do so. There are a lot of, I think, back office considerations and then key policy questions in terms of formula distributions. That has long time, right, been a question even amongst our membership, which state gets how much, right, out of the highway trust fund that has receded actually a good amount because of more than 30% at this point of the dollars coming in from the general fund that kind of made that point moot in terms of how much the state puts in, because every state gets back more than 100% other than Texas is the outlier right now. But that's a huge challenge that will have to get resolved as well. Whether it's done through, say, trucks first that kind of, get around the privacy concern that you hear about a lot, also remains to be seen, obviously, given the opposition from the trucking associations. And Alec, you also mentioned tolling as a possibility as well. And that's something that, certainly at the state level, that's been a mainstay for a lot of the states. But it's something that we haven't quite had at the national level in terms of translating that revenue stream into, the federal trust fund. So our preference is to keep that at kind of the state, discretion. But if more flexibility could be provided for states to open up existing interstates that are banned from being tolled, I think, that's something that we would support, recognizing that then has to kind of get through each state's own political kind of gauntlet, right? Because we've had this pilot program for a long time to open up interstate tolling, but no state has been able to actually do that because, folks don't want to see tolls on interstates, not surprisingly.
I mean, here in Connecticut, toll is definitely a 4-letter word. Don't say it in polite company. Brings tough memories. But I guess a question for you specific to your role, for AASHTO. I know AASHTO is looking for, a higher share. I think I read on your website that you're looking for, 100% share of federal share for transportation projects, at least in the short term, because states have suffered loss of gas tax revenues. You also talked earlier about having less grant programs that require a ton of time to, to do the applications and more just discretionary funding programs. What sort of reaction are you getting to those suggestions at the legislative and I guess executive level?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. For COVID relief, we did receive $10 billion in the December package directly to state DOTs, and that was huge in meeting not just the capital, but operations, maintenance, administrative needs of every state DOT that were really hurting from COVID-related revenue losses. And that was provided at 100% federal share. And what we've asked Congress is that, hey, going forward, not necessarily for reauthorization, the 5-year bill, but if there is a kind of the additional infusion of funds that if the goal is to kind of get that out as quickly as possible, which typically is, what you think of as the fiscal stimulus, then making it 100% federal share obviously makes it easier than for our members to have to come up with that 20% non-federal share out of their limited and again, suffering kind of budgets. The American, I think, Rescue Plan has helped a lot, but for the state DOTs, it comes to the state governor's, discretion in terms of if they want to put that money towards state DOTs or not. So it's not quite as, I think, stable or reliable source as it was with the $10 billion at 100% federal share from December.
Great. Appreciate the answer, and wish you the best of luck working on that. And I guess one final question, I know we're running out of time, is about AASHTO and I guess the state DOT's approach to climate. And we're hearing obviously lots of investment talk about electric vehicles in the American Jobs Plan. There are also, I know, some much smaller proposals in the EPW bill about resiliency and climate mitigation. I know in the American Jobs Plan there was $20 billion for highway teardowns, which might be more about revitalization than climate. But how are you thinking about climate as obviously there's local level, federal level, state level. What do state DOTs think is their role for climate?
Absolutely. So, we are actually working to update our board adopted policies from 2 years ago that I mentioned earlier to make sure that we're able to cover kind of the, a lot of the important topics, whether it's equity, whether it's resilience, whether it's broadband and other forms of technology deployment on highway rights of way. Climate change / carbon reduction is obviously part of those as well. I think, think that it's a no-brainer for sure when it comes to adding, additional eligibilities to the current core highway formula programs, whether it's the National Highway Performance Program is the biggest kind of the bucket of highway funding. The Surface Transportation Block Grant Program is another, to make sure that, emergency relief needs are added to it, reconstruction, rehabilitation from disasters, and, preventive activities or investments are also covered as well. One of the things that, has happened in the past is for kind of, whether it's wildfires or flooding, types of recurring activities that can be better withstood with, better infrastructure than what was originally designed. That's something that should be eligible, and I think it is going to be part of the next program. The other one is, carbon reduction. What are the roles that state DOTs can take to directly influence that? We don't think that it's through the vehicle side because we don't control, right, the vehicles on the roads in terms of the CAFE standards makes most sense for us, but that's through NHTSA and the EPA rulemaking. But EV charging infrastructure, alternative fuel charging infrastructure is something that many of our members are interested in. And so having more dollars provided and more flexibility provided to be able to install those, say, on highway rest areas that are currently prohibited from commercial activities. Those are the kinds of things that we can definitely make that direct impact to reduce carbon footprint from our sector.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. So, Joung, I want to thank you for your time today and all your thoughtful and informative answers, and certainly your presentation at the beginning. Good luck in the next, 6 to 8 weeks. I'm sure it's going to be a very busy time for you. Hopefully you can take a break, maybe, I guess, after September 30th. That'll be when you can breathe a little bit easier, but I suppose we'll see how the American Jobs Plan fares. So thanks again for your time, and to the audience, thanks for coming. Our next webinar in the series is going to focus on safety. That's going to be in a couple weeks, June 15th, also at 11 a.m. We're going to have representatives from the Governor's Highway Safety Association, as well as folks from AAA National. So we hope you can join us then. And we thank you so much for your time this morning. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you so much.